There's a moment in every interrogation room where the truth gets closer. You can feel it in the air. The detective leans forward. The suspect's jaw tightens. And then, usually, one of two things happens. Either the walls come crashing down, or they build themselves higher. This is the story of an interrogation that did something far rarer. Interrogation didn't just reveal the truth. It exposed the mind of a man who had spent his entire life imprisoned by his own lies, and showed us something deeply unsettling about human nature itself. His name was Christopher Paul Hasson, but you won't recognize it. He wasn't famous like other criminals whose names flood the news cycle. He was something quieter, something more disturbing. A man so wrapped in deception that even those closest to him never truly knew him. But in a sterile interrogation room in Maryland, over the course of several hours, one detective would unravel the carefully constructed persona that Christopher had spent decades building. And what emerged wasn't just a criminal. It was a window into the psyche of someone who had lied so often, and so completely, that the boundary between his false self and his real self had long since dissolved. Christopher Paul Hasson was born into a world of promises he would never keep and identities he would never truly inhabit. From his youth, he was a collector of false narratives. He would tell friends he was joining the military. He would invent stories about his accomplishments. He would craft elaborate tales about his relationships, his job prospects, his entire future. But the lies never felt like lies to him. They felt like possibilities, like alternate versions of himself waiting to be lived. And in his mind, perhaps they were the truest parts of him. By the time he was an adult, Hasson had perfected the art of deception. He had become a chameleon, a man who could adjust his story depending on his audience, his mood, his immediate needs. To some, he was a successful businessman. To others, he was a troubled artist seeking redemption. To still others, he was a man desperate for connection, willing to do anything to maintain a relationship. The problem was that none of these versions of Christopher were real, or rather, they were all fragments of someone so fractured that the original version had long since disappeared beneath the weight of his own inventions. Then came the interrogation, and this is where the real story begins. The detective assigned to his case was someone who understood that catching a pathological liar wasn't about tricks or tactics. It was about patience. It was about creating an environment where the lies became more exhausting than the truth, where maintaining the facade required so much energy that, eventually, the person just stopped, where the relief of confession outweighed the comfort of continued deception. The interrogation room was cold, deliberately so. The table was metal. The chairs were uncomfortable. These aren't accidents. They're designed to make you want to leave, which means you're motivated to cooperate. The detective entered with a folder that he said contained evidence. He didn't specify what kind. This was the first psychological move. In Hasson's mind, the folder became a threat, a mountain of truth that the detective was sitting on, waiting to crush him with it. The detective began by asking simple questions. Where had Hasson been on certain dates? What was his relationship to certain people? Whom had he contacted? What had he said to them? These questions weren't asked with anger or hostility. They were asked with genuine curiosity, as if the detective was simply trying to understand. And that tone, that apparent openness, is what makes a pathological liar's resistance so difficult to maintain. Because if someone is going to keep lying, they need to feel like they're being attacked. They need an enemy to hide from. But if someone is simply asking you to help them understand, what excuse do you have for dishonesty? As the interrogation continued, the detective introduced small pieces of evidence, not the entire folder, just one thing at a time. A phone record showing a call Hasson had denied making, a receipt from a store he claimed never to have visited, a text message from a person he said he'd never contacted. Each piece of evidence contradicted a lie Hasson had already told. And crucially, Hasson didn't know what was in the rest of the folder. This is where psychology becomes a weapon. Hasson's mind began to work against him. He started imagining what other evidence the detective might have. He began constructing newer, more elaborate lies to accommodate the pieces of truth that had already been revealed. He was trying to weave contradictions into a coherent narrative, like someone trying to repair a torn fabric by adding more tears to it. The effort was exhausting. After hours of this, something shifted. The detective didn't increase pressure. If anything, he eased off. He told Hassan that he understood, that many people make mistakes, that many people lie when they're scared, that lying doesn't make you a bad person, it just makes you human. This compassion, offered at the exact right moment, is what breaks liars. They're not expecting it. They're braced for judgment, for condemnation, for an attack. But compassion? Compassion makes the walls crumble. And that's when Hassan broke. Not suddenly, but gradually, the lies began to crack. First, he admitted to something small, some minor deception that seemed inconsequential. Then, emboldened by the fact that the detective hadn't responded with anger, he admitted to something larger. And then something larger still. Like opening a dam, the confessions poured out. Years of deceptions, schemes, manipulations, all of it came flooding out because, in that moment, Hassan realized something crucial. He was exhausted. But here's what the detective discovered that made this interrogation truly significant. Hassan wasn't lying to hurt people. He wasn't lying for money or power or some grand criminal purpose. He was lying because, at some point so far in his past that he couldn't even identify when it had happened, he had lost the ability to tell the difference between reality and fiction. His lies had become his reality. He had convinced himself of his own deceptions with such completeness that contradiction felt like an attack on his very identity. When confronted with evidence that contradicted his lies, Hassan wasn't facing external truth. He was facing an existential crisis. Because if these lies weren't real, then what was real? If these stories he'd told weren't true, then who was he? The interrogation wasn't just an interrogation. It was a confrontation with the void at the center of his being. It was a forced acknowledgement that the person he had constructed was hollow. This is what makes the interrogation so psychologically relevant. Most criminals confess because they're afraid of consequences or because they realize their crime has been discovered. But Hassan confessed because he was confronted with the fundamental unreality of his existence. He was forced to look directly at the fact that he had spent his entire life living a lie so complete that he had lost himself within it. And once that realization took hold, continuing the deception felt pointless. The detective understood something crucial that many interrogators miss. A pathological liar isn't lying because they're evil. They're lying because they're broken. Their mind has fragmented in such a way that truth and fiction have become indistinguishable. To break them, you don't need evidence or threats or clever tricks. You need to help them see themselves clearly. And that's almost always more devastating than any accusation could ever be. In the hours following the interrogation, as Hassan sat in his cell, something profound happened. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, there were no more stories to tell, no more personas to maintain, no more audiences to perform for. And in that silence, he was forced to confront who he actually was. Not the businessman, not the artist, not the man desperate for connection. Just Christopher, broken, exhausted, and finally, horrifyingly, honest. The interrogation that broke Christopher Paul Hassan wasn't notable because it solved a crime or brought a criminal to justice. It was notable because it revealed something about the human mind that we rarely see. It showed us that the most dangerous lies we tell are the ones we tell ourselves. It showed us that identity is not fixed or real, but rather a story we tell about ourselves constantly. And that when someone tells that story so many times that they believe it completely, breaking that story becomes an act of psychological violence, even when it's justified. And perhaps most importantly, it showed us that the path to confession, to truth, to redemption even, doesn't always lie through confrontation. Sometimes it lies through compassion. Sometimes the person who breaks us isn't our enemy. Sometimes it's someone who simply sees us clearly and, for a moment, helps us see ourselves the same way. And that moment of clarity, however painful, is the moment where change becomes possible. This is the real crime that happened in that interrogation room. Not what Christopher had done, but what he had done to himself. A life lived entirely in fiction, a self constructed entirely from lies, an entire existence that meant nothing because nothing in it was real. And the interrogation that broke him didn't break his criminal enterprise or his schemes. It broke his final defense against the truth. It forced him to confront the void. And in doing so, it offered him something he had never had before: the possibility of actually being real.